Thank you so much. As he mentioned, my name's Debra Borchard. I'm the CEO, co-founder, and editor-in-chief of the cannabis financial news website, the Green Market Report. We are in our 4th year of being online, and we're very excited about that. I'm also really thrilled to be a part of this panel. It's super interesting. We've been following psychedelic companies and stocks really for the last couple of years at Green Market Report. And we, in fact, had a conference last year in January. So it was really exciting. And there's just so much with this topic that is fascinating and interesting. And I think that you'll find that that is what this panel is going to bring you, is a lot of interesting knowledge. I want to introduce my guests because they are very esteemed. We have Robert Roscow. He is Mydecine's Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder. He is a highly educated geneticist with an impressive knowledge around multiple arts of science. He has spent his academic and professional career looking for valuable and unique active medical compounds that are found in nature. We also have Paul Fruin. He is an associate professor at the University of Western Ontario. He joined the departments of psychiatry and psychology at the University of Western Ontario in September of 2008 and completed his doctorate in clinical psychology at Western and his postdoctoral residency at the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Center. And then also joining us is Dr. Denton Hauer. He is Mydecine's drug discovery consultant. He's been involved in drug discovery at leading pharmaceutical companies and research institutions for the past 30 years. He holds numerous patents and has been published extensively. I want to welcome all of you and thank you to our viewers for joining, and also to these guests who are experts in their field. So the whole point of this panel today is to really talk about what it takes to take a natural product like psilocybin that comes from mushrooms, going through a study trial, and then ultimately ending up at the end use with a patient. And there is so much that goes into this, not only from taking a natural substance and introducing it into a clinical setting, but also how do you design these study trials? How do you measure? How do you create standards? This is such a new area that it's really open to a lot of creativity and a lot of opportunity in trying to navigate your way through this. And it's really a team effort, because the people doing the studies have to work with the people that are working on the compounds so that they can talk about dosage and the effects and such. So it's a real team effort to kind of figure out, how do we design the study trial and how do we implement the study? And then ultimately, how do we get to the end result, which is helping out a patient? And so I'd like to talk about just that dance that happens between developing a drug and creating a clinical trial. I'm happy to see who wants to take, because that's quite a big task, just talking about that.
Maybe first I could say, Deborah, that you're right. Clinical trial design in this space is quite unique. And the way, one way I see it is especially unique is really the unique power of these particular medicines. Maybe the most obvious way that translates into the clinical trial design is the use of the sort of placebo control study and how that might look. Because really in psychiatry and other areas of mental health research, typically the effects of the active medicine are relatively, in fact, small compared to the placebo. If we look at classic antidepressant drugs, for example, reviews, meta-analyses looking at research for decades now, essentially suggest these medicines might give us about a 10% advantage, more or less, of a clinical effect for the active medicine, the antidepressant, as compared to the placebo. But in this case, with drugs like psilocybin, actually, it appears from the early trials published only in the last few years that the clinical effects are quite extraordinary and far superior to the placebo. And essentially, as one is administering the drug in the session while the patient is experiencing the effects, those effects are so obvious as compared to the placebo that the choice of the placebo is difficult. So this is, of course, positive result for these kinds of medicines, these kinds of interventions. But in terms of the clinical trial design, it creates some complications. And so what is the control group? What is the placebo in this case? That is an interesting question. I don't know if the others have some comments on that.
Yeah, I think Paul is really nicely hitting the nail on the head as far as the gap that we're really trying to design these studies to fill. So we have, the current standard of care that's only, slightly better than placebo, like was really nicely just described. And then we have what are effectively products of nature that are showing, vast improvement possibly, but haven't really been thought of in a modern pharmaceutical lens at all. And so there's, both a character of how do we design the studies to understand that potential in the product of nature, but then how can we also take the last, 100 years of pharmaceutical development and drug design chemistry and apply that as well to improving the standing point that it is now as just as a product of nature. And so highlights both sides of that, where the clinical studies can address that gap, and then also we can improve the actual actives for better use in therapy practice.
And a lot of the reasons that these studies are being done are to treat, as you noted, certain mental health issues, whether it's drug-resistant depression or trauma. And as you noted, there's a vast majority of patient population that suffers from depression. And then you also have a group of those patients who are referred to as drug resistant. So they've been taking these chemical compounds sometimes for years, never really getting any better, switching different cocktails of compounds and different chemicals and still never really getting better, and doing that alongside therapy. And so, like you said, from some of the indications here, early indications are that by using psilocybin, for example, that some patients are seeing dramatic results from that.
What I could really say is I think in this space, really the trials were addressing some of the most difficult to treat patients, essentially by definition. As you say, Debra, they've been treatment resistant to the standard approaches. Those are, for the most part, antidepressant drugs, but we should also say, in fact, that in the psychotherapy space as well, many of the patients have not been able to fully recover from their depressions through, be it psychological means, cognitive behavior therapy, and other approaches, interpersonal psychotherapy and others, as well as the antidepressants. So really, this has been a difficult to treat group. And in this space, the researchers and the clinicians have really actually adopted to start there, to start with the most difficult patients. Debra, what you do say, though, is you have discussed both depression and, on the other hand, trauma. And these really are potentially different groups. One can become depressed as a result of traumatic life events, but one can also become depressed through other means. What I would emphasize at this point is that the trials that have been conducted for psilocybin have been with the group of depression and not necessarily yet have addressed the trauma group. But I think actually some of the trials that are being proposed, supported in part by Mydecine, include some new proposals to actually address persons with significant trauma, be it veterans with PTSD and other groups. And that is just so wonderful to see. We really need especially novel treatments for this group. When we look at depression, we do have people with quotes, treatment-resistant depression. They have not gotten better through the typical approaches. But in trauma, I would say trauma is really difficult to treat as a norm. These are not a subset of the groups. This is rather people with trauma are often very difficult to treat. And so this approach to develop novel interventions for that group is just so needed, and I'm so grateful to be a part of this, that indeed Mydecine and others are looking to try and provide some support to persons with significant trauma in their lives, helping them recover.
And I would think one of the big challenges in administering a psilocybin type of drug is, there's clearly it's categorized as a psychedelic drug. They're hallucinogens. If you take quite a bit, you're going to have quite the experience, and potentially a very intense experience. How do you address that within the study structure? Because that might be unsettling to some patients if it's too much and the experience is too intense, or that might be what's necessary is to have this intense experience. How are you tackling that particular aspect?
So this is really where drug development and drug design concept can really come to play, because effectively we have, a product of nature that we haven't done any sort of thought with on, what is its time course? What is its ability to be dosed precisely? There's really big questions about how is dosing actually used? Is it, a linear relationship with body weight or not? There's, still these very big questions. And so using, techniques for co-formulation, novel molecule design, et cetera, really allows us to take what's effectively a very, very valuable template in psilocybin and then make small changes that allow it to be more compatible with therapy to reduce, possibly negative side effects, like you're mentioning with anxiety, for instance. Also, to the intensity of the experience is definitely something that seems like it's part of the necessary process, but being able to get the control of that experience to the therapist, both in time and intensity, would be really, really desirable. And these are things that we're directly addressing with drug development, and will be kind of solved that way.
And with a natural product, I know, I always knew of psychedelic mushrooms being found in cow manure, and that's certainly not a great place to study this product. How are you addressing the standardization of the raw material? It is a natural product. How are you tackling that aspect of just actually getting that raw natural material into a form that can be studied?
So this is something where taking a look at both modern cultivation practices for edible mushrooms, and then also laboratory style cultivation practices actually show a lot of value with psilocybin mushrooms. The ability of fungi to be adapted to many, many different growing conditions is really, really high. And so the ability to take what you're describing there, growth out in the pasture, and then move it into a highly productive system in a controlled environment, similar to a lab or a cultivation house on the edible side, really is the way to address those issues, and actually brings a lot of the control of the end product into our hands and removes it from less control.
And Dr. Hoyer, I mean, you've had experience with this, working with natural products and trying to I guess, standardize them.
Yeah, so you really apply modern analytical chemistry to the natural product. And so there's been a long history of chemists who have taken natural products and then found their active constituents, and then actually finally marketed those in purified form. Aspirin is one that was originally from the willow tree. The antihypertensives we have now were originally from a snake venom, although the compounds are completely different now. And so there are many, many examples. In fact, natural products served as the basis for the modern pharmaceutical industry. And I might mention how the psychedelic and neurofield is really kind of going back to the roots of original drug discovery. There was a period with molecular biology and doing expressing proteins that one would then purify a very specific target, like a kinase for oncology or breast cancer, and then try to develop a specific agent. And that was sort of the target to a drug approach. But historically, although except for maybe the last 20, 30 years, that was how drugs were discovered. And so now we're kind of going back to that. We're actually seeing that these compounds are active. And through a process of finding, well, what are the constituents that are the really true actives, or is it a number of constituents working together? We can now actually discover things that nature is teaching us. We can discover new targets, that is, new enzymes and receptors that might be activated. And so it's really opened up a lot of the, particularly the CNS field, where we've taken clues, but and then tried to develop them in a sort of narrow-minded approach. But the psychedelics are a little different. They sort of turn things on their head and kind of return back to more what we used to call the phenotypic or the physiological effect way of finding drugs. And they have this long history now, I would call it long, of we know what their relative safety issues are. We don't know a lot about the metabolites in many cases. In many cases we do. So there's really a rich area for research there to fine-tune these molecules and provide a better drug for a specific disease, or use the natural product in its mix if that's appropriate.
I know within the cannabis industry, we've had a bit of a debate going between synthetic cannabinoids and natural cannabinoids. Most of the industry prefers the natural way to go. They feel the natural compounds bring so much more to the patient and or to people using it for recreational purposes. Is that debate raging within the mushroom world? Are people debating whether a synthetic psilocybin versus a natural psilocybin compound and whether one is better than the other?
Yes, absolutely. That's an active area of debate right now. And so the majority of the work that's already been done to a clinical level is basically with just a pure synthesized psilocybin molecule. So there's no other similar tryptamines or related compounds. And when the mushrooms are actually producing psilocybin, they're not only producing that alone, they're producing related similar compounds, similar to your example with the cannabis space where you have THC plus related minor cannabinoids, and it's that mix that really gives you the full breadth of the effect. And so this is actually, in a pharmacological sense, one of the most complex things to look at, this combinatorial space of many different active drugs, and how does the exact precise formulation change from just one of the components. And so this is something that as a company, we're really looking at to stepwise into that complexity by first looking at the purified compound from a natural source, which leaves open the option of including these other compounds, also studying them along the way, et cetera. And so we really see that as a long-term, really valuable proposition, but at the moment it technically is a very complex one that's actively under research. So definitely an open debate and an interesting one currently.
And I'm sure it will continue to rage on with people, feeling passionately on both sides. So if we've been able to, as you say, kind of hone in on the compounds and what particular ones you want to use to address the issue of depression, how are you then figuring out dosage and measuring, and you kind of mentioned before, dealing with a patient's weight. How are you starting off with designing those studies?
Well, let me address how you would do that for a standard drug, which is usually a very pure material. You actually have to know what the body does to the drug. So you need to know how well is it absorbed if it's given orally. What is the rate of elimination? In other words, your liver functions to basically remove any what we'll call xenobiotic compounds from the body, which is, I think that's a consequence of us being omnivores and eating lots of plant materials. Our livers are very good at getting rid of things. And so you actually have to make sure that your drug gets to where it needs to be, whether it's the brain, whether it's the peripheral nervous system, or whether it's the stomach or some other organ. And then you need to measure how long it's there and if it's doing what you think it is. And so if you want to study a drug product, whether it's a natural extract, you would have to know which constituents you're looking for. And so that's where the analytical part comes in. And then you need to follow those over a time course, and so that you know how often you need to give a dose. So that's a field of study called pharmacokinetics. And what the drug does to the body is pharmacology, and what the body does to the drug is pharmacokinetics. And you really need both of those things to be able to do the dosages. And you can just dose a substance, and you can look for physiological effects, but you're usually much better off. And if you want to get approval for a new formulation, then you'll have to actually go in more depth and satisfy the governmental requirements for pharmacokinetics.
Right, and I would think that you've identified the patients, and one of the issues I think that kind of rolls around psilocybin is length or time of experience. As you pointed out, your body's absorption of the compound and how long it takes to work through that till elimination, as you noted. Is that also, I would think, an issue that you have to deal with in your drug design and your study design? Is if you administer this compound to a patient, how long is that experience going to last? Because, maybe people don't have 8 hours to sit back and relax and go through this experience. They may only want it to be compressed into a shorter amount of time. How are you addressing that aspect of the studies?
So the time aspect can be addressed with precise pharmacology by basically understanding the half-life of the exact active that you're using, and then understanding how that can be moved with formulary changes. So that really is addressable in that sense, essentially looking at molecules, including psilocybin, that are very similar. There's a family of molecules there that have different time courses. And so that's a direct way of doing it. And then the issue of time course is actually a key one right now, because the best medical efficacy and the best data around the use of this is really matched hand in hand with therapy. And Paul can definitely speak to this in depth. But the idea is that it's not necessarily the 8 hours of hallucinatory experience. It's actually the therapy that goes on around that in the days prior and after, and how you actually integrate that experience. And so there may actually be a window of, say, a few weeks in which the therapy is actually significantly more effective. And this is what, one of the ways that we're really trying to tease out the medical utility here, is understanding that window, understanding its best matching to therapy. And so that really is a key issue right now. And really interesting, because it's not necessarily just the obvious effects of intoxication. It's also this after effect and its potential use in a combination therapy.
And Paul, I would think that is really down your avenue of, picking the patients for the studies has got to be a real trick and an art. And then I would also think to Robert's point, there's it isn't just the drug, because most of these patients are getting therapy with the drug. And how are you kind of designing that aspect of these studies? Are they getting a certain level of therapy prior to taking the drug, a certain level of therapy afterwards? How does that factor in?
Absolutely. So I think what we've been discussing so far, they're really sort of the three pillars from decades of research when these substances were actually legal, and there was much more research done. Really, the three pillars were understood to be dose, and we've been talking beyond dose, but to the underlying pharmacology. But really, if we put that into one pillar, sort of the dose and the mechanistic effects at the pharmacological and molecular levels, and then really the other pillars are really psychological effects. They are the set and setting that is classically discussed. And these, as you say, Deborah, have to do with the person factors. Those are really the set. So what is this person like? What do we know about this person? For example, their trauma history, clinical information that we may have about their depression, their personality type, their attachment status, their early life experiences. All of these are going to come to bear potentially and predict the kind of experience they're going to have under the effects of the substance. And then, of course, there's a setting which has to do with the immediate surroundings of the place in which the substance is consumed and the therapy takes place. And all of those are very important. And really, it doesn't, it's not an easy prediction, actually. While we can make a fairly clear prediction around the dosing of the substance, and a higher dose, of course, is going to have a more significant psychological effect, it's difficult, more difficult to predict these set and setting factors. And so those are going to be very important in the design of the trial. When we're looking, as we've already discussed, we're looking at potentially treating people with PTSD and depression, with significant trauma histories, veterans, for example. Those factors are going to be very important. We're going to want to do a very thorough psychological assessment before, and we're going to want to take extraordinary care during the experience to make sure that the person is not overly distressed, is able to essentially understand the experience and make use of it as much as they can towards their recovery. And a lot of that is going to be in the preparation phase and the integration phase. As Rob really said, the effects of the substance are not just potentially the period of time of the drug half-life, and 8 hours you've mentioned, Debra, is often a prediction that we could make, but there's some individual differences around that. Is it 6 hours? Is it maybe 10 or 12? But in any case, there's that, there's the acute effects, but then there's also the sort of integration phase, which, as Rob alluded to, might be a period of days, even weeks after, in which the person continues to remember a lot of what occurred and engages in, a process of trying to understand what happened, what is the meaning of that, what have I learned from this experience, and how can I, take that experience and transfer it to my greater life, hopefully as a means to recover from the prior difficulties that I experienced, perhaps as a veteran or in other contexts, different traumas I may have experienced in my early life, more recent life. This experience is going to bear on that. It's going to give me some messages, give me some information, give me some different perspective potentially. And we're going to internalize that, not just during the period of acute intoxication, but over the days and weeks subsequent to that.
So we've kind of talked about the beginning of the stage, the raw material, getting that raw material, standardizing it, putting it in a form that can be studied, then figuring out, okay, we know we want to study this patient group. We know we're going to figure out the dosage and intensity of experience. But you brought up a good point, Paul, about the post-treatment, like what happens after. So they've gone through the study, they've taken the compound, and they've had the treatment. How are you measuring afterwards? Are you, I'm sure there's a battery of questions, are you feeling happier? Do you have any suicidal tendencies or ideations? Is that part of the process too? Is I guess just a questionnaire of sorts to measure the effectiveness?
I'm going to say that this is really a thorough assessment needs to be undertaken. And you're right, Debra, some of these factors have been studied through self-report questionnaires. And we have a number of dimensions, psychological dimensions that are relevant to ask about subsequent to an experience like this. We're definitely going to first want to probe more so what took place during the experience, because this really is a highly personal one. And the audience may or may not know that oftentimes during the clinical trials of psychedelics like psilocybin, relatively little is expressed on the part of the person having that experience. They may actually be essentially lying in bed with sort of a nighttime eye cover, and for the most part, relatively quiet, not speaking too much. And the guidelines tend to encourage that kind of a situation where they're not probed too much. It's really seen to be potentially intrusive, and rather the therapist is essentially encouraging them to experience whatever they are experiencing and providing some supportive context. But beyond that, in the end, we don't necessarily know too much about what they experienced. So that's going to be part of the assessment. What went on? What did you learn? How did you benefit from this kind of an experience? And then, like you say, in the longer term as well, in the days and weeks, we're going to ask about different experiences that we might expect to be part of the long-term healing of an experience like this. In the research, it's been described openness to experience is one dimension that we can expect. A person might be very closed-minded, ruminative, seeing themselves and others and their life in a very narrow perspective, and now they're sort of opened up and they consider, different perspective, the other side of the argument. They're more able to occupy the other person's shoes in the relationship, and so then they're more sort of fluid and able to adapt and flexible in their perspective. So this openness is something that we might look for. Interestingly, some other dimensions of personality, like even mindfulness. It's been shown that long-term effects of taking in some of these substances include increasing in trait mindfulness. So more self-attuned to your own experience, more able to be receptive to others and sort of noticing and being more empathic about their experience. And so some of these are the positive outcomes. And actually, so far in the research, there really hasn't been significant adverse effects for any of these in any of these trials. But I think that really has to do with the selection of the right patient. And so there would be the expectation of risk factors or contraindications to taking some of these drugs. For example, having prior psychotic episode or psychotic disorders in the family genetically. Some of those essentially are exclusion criteria for these trials. But if we, avoid and do a good assessment prior to the trial, then at this point there hasn't been any description so far of any significant adverse effects, and so we shouldn't necessarily expect, as you say, suicidality or anything of the sort. But hopefully we can support the person in the short term, and ideally then in the long term, it's more likely that we might have this increase in openness to experience, increase in mindfulness, and lowering of the problems that they had before, be it depression or PTSD or other mental health issues.
You brought up something that's super interesting where you mentioned, that them not wanting to be probed during the experience. In most study trials, if you're taking a, high blood pressure drug, there's so much measuring going on during the trial and during the study. But this type of that makes it even harder to figure out what's going on if you're not, if the patient isn't saying what's happening and you're not really able to question them as to what's happening.
So this is one of the really exciting things, is that the positive aspects that Paul's describing there, this increase in openness, this increase in possible learning or different perceptions of novel stimuli, these sort of ways of talking about just being more open to life experience that may actually be majorly helpful to patients in these categories. The biology is actually catching up really quickly with the ability to track that in a survey-based manner. And so this is really taking shape as both, sort of advanced bioinformatics, the ability to look at, gene use and regulation, genotype, and sort of match all of that together. That's getting better year over year and is really likely going to be able to address this question. Similarly, advanced imaging like functional MRI, MEG scanning, these sorts of things are allowing us to actually have a video, if you will, of what's going on in the brain. They're not perfect, but they're a huge step forward from what we had in the past. And so, the potential here has really been highlighted by these, what I like to call kind of macro, person level surveys where we see these effects, we can see the trends in patients, but if we can match that as well with a neuron to neuron and kind of systems understanding upwards, those two are really what's needed to address, questions of, regulatory efficacy, safety, these sorts of things. It's the fact that the two of those are kind of coming together is really exciting to me as a scientist, and then also for this research in general. So
I can imagine that might be kind of an interesting situation if you're down and taking psilocybin and then going in an MRI machine. I don't know.
Well, that's exactly what some of our advisory board members, that's exactly what they've done with some of their research and shown really, really nice side-by-side results where, patients, especially with severe depression, start looking like in an fMRI, like healthy patients that have never been depressed post-psilocybin. And so it's really illustrative that way.
And I would think, are there other measurements you can do? Are you also, maybe while people are having the psilocybin administered, are you, having their pulse checked and I don't know, any kind of brain frequency action or any of those things being done?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of these measures, as compared to, the probing verbally of what are you experiencing right now, which is potentially quite intrusive and sort of contrary to, the ideally what's actually occurring psychologically, that could be very interruptive. A lot of these measures can be acquired passively, unobtrusively. We could be certainly measuring basic indicators of CNS function, like through EEG, or blood oxygenation in an FNIR system, something like this. While the person is laying there, it's essentially being acquired and potentially analyzed actually in real time. Rob, we've discussed in a recent meeting, having basically a TV behind the bed, and we literally can observe some of these sort of macro indicators, like you were saying, Rob, second by second, actually, so we can see changes occurring. But I think, and as you say, Debra, as well, a number of other indicators may indeed be relevant, things like blood pressure, heart rate, and its variability. Those all are sort of very general indicators of essentially the arousal of the person. Are they, in fact, obviously highly aroused, perhaps distressed, or perhaps that high level of arousal is in fact sort of a positive indication that they're experiencing some excitement that is in fact something that they see as helpful. So it's hard always to know, and we may need to query and check in, but some of those measures can easily be acquired during the experience. But this, I would really emphasize, these kinds of measures, what we're trying to understand here is the mechanism of the ultimate therapeutic effect. But ultimately, what we really want to see is the long-term benefit. So we don't want to just understand, the physiology and the psychology of the experience while under the obvious immediate effects of the substance, but rather the long-term outcomes. And so I think beyond just having them be in an MRI machine, for example, while they're intoxicated, instead, let's also consider to do the MRI a couple weeks or a month after the experience. And if we can see a normalization at that moment, that's even more convincing, because ultimately that's what we really want for our patients to recover from their mental problems, depression, PTSD, for them to recover. And so if we can see some of those biological markers of the recovery, the long-term recovery, that's going to be especially encouraging.
And I want to just let our readers know, or our listeners know, that if you have some questions, start to think about them, and we will, address those pretty soon. So I wanted to touch on the patients, as you mentioned. I know that Mydecine's working with Alberta University on studying the study design relationships. Can we talk a little bit about that and how that relationship is working with them?
Yes, I think the relationship there is sort of twofold. We both have a relationship with them as a study site for our PTSD clinical work that we're discussing here, and they're also the site where a lot of our drug development work goes on as well. And so it's a multifaceted partnership there. But really, the way that this partnership is working, and this is sort of a good example there, is we're targeting veterans populations with PTSD that are highly treatment resistant. And the reason for doing this is because we really feel that if we can show efficacy in what is widely considered one of the most sort of at need and hardest to address population sets, that it'll also then work for other sets of subsets of patients with trauma. And so that's really the core reason of why we focused on that patient group. And we feel like it's a very much at need patient group that we have some ability to actually address. And so it's those multifaceted sort of points as to why we've chosen and gone with that.
Well, I know you said better science leads to better access to patients, correct?
Absolutely. No, that's the way I always like to see it, is that the science leads the way to the best access and the safest access to patients.
So what are your main studies right now? You mentioned the vets and the PTSD.
So the work that we're doing right now primarily consists at the clinical level of a series of PTSD studies that are really looking at this exact interplay of therapy and dosage, timing of dosage, exactly like we've been talking about. And Alberta is one location of those 7. And so the goal there really is to be able to look at that combinatorial space and then move forward into later stages, the best results, because we really don't know, like we've been talking about, the exact style of therapy to match with psilocybin dosage, the exact timing. Is there therapy before, therapy after? And so these are really questions that we're going to be able to address across that footprint. The company is also really interested in, like I was mentioning, this mechanistic understanding. And so we've been looking at maintaining shared measures across all of our clinical work so that we can address that. And then we have pointed research at the preclinical level, animal model level, looking at this with the University of Maryland. We're sponsoring some research there, looking at exactly what we've been talking about here in an animal model system and understanding the sort of after effect from a neuron level up. And then finally, the company with our scientific advisors, we're sponsoring 2 microdosing studies right now, one at London and then the other in Sydney, Australia. And the idea here is to, again, understand when and where can we reduce dosage and maintain the therapeutic potential, because if really it's matching therapy with dosage of psilocybin, there's a really open question as to whether you need this large dose that then is hard to provide, the correct care around, or whether you can provide a lower dose more constantly across the same period, just to make kind of 2 examples. But this is really an open question. So that's kind of a bits and pieces of how the company is really addressing this from a low dosage, from a high dosage, and then an indication specific point of view. And we think that it really will, the different avenues will all see synergies as we move forward.
I do see we have some questions in our Q&A feed. I'm going to go on and touch on some of those. We got a question from Ryan who asked, can you talk about analogs? Are you in favor of them? Why are they important? How many potential analogs are there?
So we have been looking at that across at least a couple, perhaps more, of different kinds of psychedelics. And we think there's real promise there. Obviously, that's a little longer term. But we've also started to file patent space around that, and it's a very active area of research.
Yeah, this is effectively the area that allows all of the tunability that we were describing. And really, if you think of psilocybin as the template, and the question is partly the number of analogs that are possible or relevant. It's almost an infinite number, because as that template, there's so many molecular changes that can be made there, and also there's a lot more diversity of this template and then analogs in nature than is currently well understood. And so it's really a wide open field for research and value in this space, and really seeing benefit to patients in the long run.
Yeah, and another important part is that there are other areas we'd like perhaps to move into, but we don't, the safety issue is a bit of an unknown, and that has been a problem with some of the street drugs, which have some very interesting pharmacology effects and CNS effects and could be very potent therapeutics, and in fact are potent therapeutics. But we think there's real promise there for making these drugs even safer.
Florian asks, and this is a great question, to what degree are regulations of psychoactive substance slowing down research, and is it harder to finance a project or get it approved by the government? So we certainly know that there are levels of legality and illegality with these substances here in the United States.
So all the work that we're doing is 100% clinically focused. It's either R&D in a lab or is meant to go directly into clinical trials. And so that actually, because of that, the legalities are very similar, if not exactly the same, to any other novel pharmaceutical development. There's a lot of regulatory steps that we have to comply with, but they're really well set out and defined. And so there's a nice pathway that we can follow with the correct due diligence. That's a really clear pathway, although complex. So that's actually relatively nice. My prior professional experience was in the cannabis industry, which I think is the exact sort of poster child of the opposite of that, where everything is in a gray area, and it actually creates a whole lot of barriers to institutional funding, to all sorts of logistical hurdles, if you will. This is really not that. It's much more analogous to a pharmaceutical type development, and has similar levels of, or exactly the same levels of regulatory hurdles and documentation, et cetera, that we have to deal with.
We have another question. We kind of touched on this just a little bit, but we have a question on measuring the experiences that the patients have, because these substances are so notoriously varying inter and intrapersonally. That's certainly, my experience from the people I know that have done this. Some people might have, like I said, a very intense experience. The person next to them might have had the same amount and had experience. Some people have, a very bad experience. How do you take something that has such widely varying potential situations and then trying to standardize that?
So one of the main sources of variability there is the fact that it's most commonly consumed in a recreational fashion as a whole dried mushroom or a whole fresh mushroom of some sort. There's actually a ton of variability in this chemistry, mushroom to mushroom to mushroom. It's very dependent on their environmental growing conditions, exactly what the substrate that they're growing in is. And so even within what seems like a similar batch, there can actually be quite stark differences in what somebody might be consuming compared to the person next to them. So that's at least one point. And that can be directly addressed with the type of pharmaceutical chemistry that we've been talking about, purifying the compounds, knowing their level of purity, and knowing if you're making a mixture, exactly the components really addresses a lot of that variability.
So here's a question from Andrew, and he does preface this with all due respect. He says, I'm curious if the speakers and listeners have consumed a large enough dosage to experience a substantial trip, air quotes, not in a scientific capacity. No one's saying crickets chirping. Well, Andrew, I will say that I did do this on a recreational basis, but it was a very long time ago in college, and I did grow up in Texas, and so it was pretty. As I mentioned, the cow situation, it was pretty prevalent there that you could go out into a pasture and pick mushrooms and entertain yourself over the weekend for free.
I think
that was a long time ago.
I think the experience across the company is probably relatively similar to Debra's, but then also really I think one of the things that we really keeps us coming to work every day and keeps us really excited about this project is that all of us know anecdotally people who have had access to this sort of therapy in a more underground fashion, and this usually takes the form of tourism type medicine where people are able to travel to where this is more readily available, usually in a shamanistic sort of context, and that is as powerful in my mind as a lot of the clinical data. There's very, very strong anecdote from the general population that this is really, really beneficial. They're kind of using it in a gray market wellness context, and so I think we see all those positives from the positive experiences that people report recreationally to more pointed use in the gray market. Absolutely.
If I can just make a general point. Avoiding the personal if I can, but what I'll like to say, because I think this question is a very important question, and that really relates to the therapeutic application. For example, if I am teaching meditation, I think the people that I'm guiding through the practice of meditation are going to hope that I'm a meditator myself, that I've had some experience. If I'm the guide of the terrain, and so I think it's a relevant question. And so when we're providing these therapies, the audience should know that actually one of the models, which is the MAPS model, is highly encouraging of the therapist to have some firsthand experience of these effects. So that they can help their patients navigate this terrain in the preparation, during the experience in a supportive way, and in the integration phase.
That's actually a really open question in the field right now is, do the therapists need to have this experience personally to be effective? And then if so, how do you actually provide that as part of a training context? I mean, you can imagine in a current modern medical school, it's not common for people to be self-administering the drugs that they're learning how to administer to patients. But if you think about medical practice, 50 years or earlier, this was actually relatively common for anesthesiologists, and with a lot of the foundation of anesthesiology was self-experimentation among anesthesiologists. So there is this sort of open question of how and when and where to give the therapists that are providing this therapy the experience that they need to have that sort of context so that they can meet their patients, where they're at.
Well, and I think that layers into some of the situations you see in the cannabis industry. There's a lot of sensitivity to people being CEOs and running these big cannabis corporations that maybe don't use cannabis, never have used cannabis, and don't really have a relationship with that particular product, yet they're running these companies and they're in charge of selling it and growing it.
Yeah, I think in that context, it's absolutely questionable for somebody who's selling a recreational product to not be a consumer of the same recreational product. I think that's very much questionable. The thing that's very different about our work is that everything that we're doing with psychedelics is clinically focused. It's all medically focused. And so really the question then becomes making sure that the therapist has the experience that they need to be effective for their patients, as opposed to, making sure that the leadership of the company has the recreational experience. It's a very different context in a lot of ways that way. And so it's
right. And you wouldn't expect a traditional biotech company, you wouldn't expect that if your company is developing a drug for diabetes, that the CEO has to try this diabetes drug, even if he doesn't have diabetes.
No.
That we wouldn't be comfortable with that.
So the situation here, very much.
Yeah,
so.
it's a very.
You wouldn't expect people to self-try pain medications.
Exactly.
So no, that's why I was back to. It's very similar to developing a pain drug. Very similar level of regulation, similar level of ethical concerns, etc.
Yeah, my personal experience is zero, and what attracts me to the field, coming from a very hardcore pharmacy or pharmaceutical background, is the incredible interest and results that I've seen with this, and what I see as from just a scientific point of view. I consider this approach breakthrough. I mean, I think everybody here does, but it's really just you read the literature, you see what the molecules can do, you see what the promise is, and there's much more to be done, but there's incredible potential there, and that's really what attracted me to it. It's almost unprecedented in drug development.
And we did get a question, kind of touching back on what you said about the molecules, that there's so much variability within these active components within the mushroom. Does Mydecine plan to, the question is, does Mydecine ever plan to work with natural products, or will you be working exclusively with purified synthetic compounds? But Dr. Hoyer, you did mention that these mushrooms have so many different elements to them. How are you able to, I guess, hone in on exactly what you need or what you're going to study?
Yeah, so Rob can speak to that too, but definitely we are looking at all the constituents we can identify, and of course we can see all the major ones we expect, but also ones we've never seen before. So there's a lot of promise there. And so that's where the research starts. You have to know what you're looking at. And to do clinical studies, if you're going to dose a mixture, you have to know that it's uniform, as Rob said. And he can talk to that more, but that's a critical piece, is knowing what you're working with.
Yeah, really the first step is the analytical chemistry, exactly like Dan was saying, is understanding exactly the constituents that you have. And so we have strong resources there through the University of Alberta to be able to look at raw biomass and then basically tease apart every one of the active components there. That then produces the base components that we can use in matched preclinical work that really demonstrates the exact details that we're talking about here in those preclinical studies, or in vitro bench scale type studies that are designed to really tease apart what's the exact half-life, what are the exact receptor binding properties, the mechanistic pieces of how is this working, its time course, its potency, et cetera. And that's really, it's the two of those hand in hand that give us the data we need there.
And that's so exciting, where, like you said, because there's so much that isn't known. And as you're as you said, pulling these threads apart and starting to figure out separation of these different compounds and elements, and one might address the drug-resistant depression, one might address the trauma, one might even address addiction. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we're hearing that could be targeted. We did get a question asking, what kind of work are you doing within the company protocols or within your research cohorts to include diversity and equity for marginalized communities to benefit from the positive results? Good question.
So partly we're addressing that by having a diversity of sites. So we have sites across multiple countries, so that's partly addressing that geographically. The studies themselves are relatively small scale, and so then issues of diversity within each study, and then maybe Paul can maybe explain to his location and how this might be addressed there, but it really falls down to the individual institution and ensuring that we're getting a representative population. Certainly it's also within our scientific desire and really need to include a diverse population. It's not only the ethical right thing to do, but it also, if we only have a subset of the population, that's not representative of data that then speaks to other parts of the population outside of that. And so there's a really strong scientific need as well, actually, to have a diversified population in these studies to make sure that the effects that we see are equally applicable across the board.
Which kind of goes back to what you were talking about, Paul, about the choosing the patients for the studies.
Well, that's true, Deborah, and I would also say that I feel this line of care is actually perhaps better able to address the cultural and diversity issues that many of the standard care interventions for mental health have not. Actually, typically this intervention is very individualized. It's very much about the person's own unique experience, as compared to sort of these group level approaches where you might only get a matter of a few short minutes with your psychiatrist, who uses a very simple algorithm to administer different medications, that it's sort of more or less a one-size-fits-all approach. This is very much individualized, especially in the preparation and I would say the integration phases. We really need to understand who this person is before they take the substance. We need to understand how they experience themselves and others and their life, reality, the meaning of life even during the experience, and then how those factors continue to become internalized and shape over time. And so this is going to vary for different persons, including by culture. And it's just a real care that's taken to those factors, I think, in this whole line of intervention as compared to the typical approach that's taken in psychiatry and psychology.
You know, and I think that that question really kind of points us to kind of the end aspect of this whole long road, which is insurance, paying for treatments. You know, I think that, you know, you had mentioned this, Paul, about that the response from some of these studies is quite dramatic. And I have read, you know, the situations where you have patients who have taken, you know, antidepressant drugs for years and they're expensive, going to a therapist, you know, for an hour each week or month or whatever, that's expensive. Sometimes people don't have insurance that will cover mental health expenses. So you might have people that need these things, but just literally can't afford it. But an insurance company might be more open to a situation where a company says, hey, 3 treatments, you're going to get a huge result for your patient. And while it may cost this, you're only going to have to, you know, in the long run, it's actually going to be more economical and better for the person.
Well, I'd love to say that I think what's really going to be looked at in the next couple of years are the potential cost benefit. You know, as compared to standard care, this is a completely different approach. So you're right, Deborah. It may only take a matter of a few sessions as compared to, you know, weekly sessions for years, or different pills taken daily for years. It's just a completely different approach. But what I think we haven't heard yet among this panel, I'd love to raise it, is that we may actually be looking at you know, a cure here. I would say in mental health treatment, we are almost never talking about cures. We are talking about, you know, long-term chronic care and you know, symptom reduction, lessening the severity of the problem, but never fully resolving the problem. I shouldn't say never, but perhaps rarely. And so this is just the difficulties that people are facing with different mental health issues, depression, PTSD. We've been talking about. They have been difficult to treat through the typical approaches, but now we're really looking at something that is possibly at the level of, you know, full recovery, fully, you know, returning to lives that are involving a high level of well-being, a high level of, you know, experienced safety in relationships, a high level of function in the workplace, and you know, just an experience of oneself that is just fully different from the kind of experience a person has had perhaps all their life before this. So we're looking at something that is possibly life-changing and a true recovery in the mental health area. That's very novel.
The take-home point for that too, for the insurance companies, is really, if you think through, you know, from a patient and like the patient care point of view of what Paul's describing there, the curative properties and or the, you know, really, you know, strong increase in quality of life, it's also going to address a whole lot of comorbid conditions or tangential conditions. People that have a very low quality of life are likely to have other chronic health conditions that are going to be expensive to treat. And therefore it can be kind of seen as a more holistic cost reduction, better wellness type measure for the insurance company. I think honestly, once that's well demonstrated, it'll be a sea change in how these therapies are prescribed.
Well, I have seen studies that talk about the effect on the economy for people that when they have mental health issues, just day-to-day functioning, reporting to work,
Yep.
being productive at work, being able to earn a living, pay their bills. It's just got a whole, cycle on our economy. We did get a question. I think this is kind of interesting. Seeing a risk, here's the question. I see some risks, for instance, looking at the ketamine treatments in the history of antidepressants of the therapeutic support eroding over time and psychedelics merely being used pharmacologically. How do you guys feel about that?
I think all the best evidence so far is really pointing to that you need to have therapy or psychological treatment matched with the dosage. There's a lot of questions as to how this is best matched still, but really the effect and the dramatic sort of nature of the improvement of the effect goes away if you're not also providing the therapy aspect. And so I would be surprised if it's completely removed, but certainly best practices may look very different than what we're seeing today 5 or 10 years down the road.
Might get dialed down a bit. Here's a question from Florian. He asks, can you walk us through the process of the clinical trial regarding PTSD in veterans? How do the appointments look like? How long is the follow-up period with the patients?
So this is slightly different for every one of our trial locations, and Paul can definitely speak to the work that he's planning. But the reason that it is different is for exactly addressing those sorts of questions. We don't know right now is 1, 2, or 3 macro doses matched with therapy, is that the best solution? Is it better to respond to the patients? Likely so. And so coming up with those enhancements on current therapy protocols to address how do you add in psilocybin as an adjunct are really why those are set up the way that they are.
I didn't know if you wanted to add something, Paul.
I'm happy to. I mean, I agree with Rob that at this time in the research, it is an exploratory phase to really understand what's the best approach. But if we look at the psychotherapy literature in general, what we really see is there is a period of preparation. Oftentimes when we think about PTSD, we think about some event that happened in the past that the person in the present is still struggling with, right? But what we might also miss is the fact that there are probably some problems in the present happening as well. So part of PTSD therapy is present focused. First, we have to address the most outstanding acute problems in the environment. And then, when we're fully prepared and ready, then we may want to, go back to the past and understand that better and understand its effects on us in the present. And, this typically takes some time, in which, of course, if you're coming to see me as a therapist, you're probably, not wanting to undertake this very significant kind of an experience, maybe highly novel. You've never used these substances before, and you've just met me. I mean, there's a period of time, hopefully, that one prepares, one gets to know the person better, develops a sort of an alliance, a therapeutic kind of feeling with the person, that they feel essentially safe to explore themselves in a more significant way than perhaps they have ever before. So there's a period of a certain number of sessions, and like Rob says, how many is that? It may be 3, it may be 4, it may be a certain period of time until the person essentially feels that it's the right kind of relationship that they have with this person. There's a trust there that they have in that relationship. And then also there's the readiness. They're here, and there's now a readiness to return to this especially difficult period of time in their life where they experience perhaps something very traumatic. Once they're ready, they may be able to then undertake 1, 2, 3 different sessions. Oftentimes it's of increasing dose, starting with a more minimal or moderate dose, and if that's not effective, trying a higher dose. And it's really going to be about what one experiences during these different doses, Does it feel like it's unfinished still? Are there parts of that experience that I still don't fully understand and I still need to address? Ultimately, it's a very individual kind of thing where once a person feels like this is now done, I understand it, it's not harming me in the same way, it doesn't feel like it's in the present anymore, it feels like it's now in the past. That is, the recovery that we're looking for, and it's very individual. But ultimately, it seems like from the depression studies, where trauma is often a cause of depression as well, that many people are going to be able to reach that level of recovery. And if it takes 2 sessions or if it takes 3 or 4, but ultimately, we're pretty confident from the early research that most people are going to be able to get there. And that's how it sort of goes. That integration phase as well is to continue to monitor. They may feel a certain way immediately after the experience, but 1 week, 2 weeks, 3, 4 into the future, there may be some concerns that newly arise in their life. They may understand it a little bit differently at that point, and so we have to go back and assess and continue to support.
The mention of ketamine treatments in the last question, I think, brings up an interesting point. We're certainly seeing a proliferation of these ketamine clinics and companies raising millions and millions of dollars to create these ketamine clinics. There is a little bit of a debate about them in the sense that, it's starting to feel like just about anybody can walk in the door and say, yeah, I'm depressed, I need a ketamine treatment. And, you fill out a form and into the room you go. And maybe that was never really the true intention of those treatments to have it be so easy to access. Maybe it's good that it's easy to access. You can see where the debate is. I think that it concerns people along the lines of, I think when California first legalized medical marijuana and anybody could walk into a storefront and say, I have a headache and get a card. Is there concern that psilocybin could end up going in that direction? And do you feel like maybe the psilocybin community doesn't really want it to go in that direction, that the ketamine clinics have gone, or maybe that's a good thing to make it as readily available as possible?
Technically, it'd be hard for psilocybin to actually follow the exact same path as ketamine. The reason that ketamine has sort of seen this rapid adoption and rapid scale of therapy is because it was an already approved anesthetic drug. And so it's basically just being used off label. And that actually is something that any physician can choose to do, but on their own discretion, is to use it off label. So that was a very accelerating step. Also, too, the initial evidence with ketamine was so strong that it kind of has allowed this ballooning outside of the original context. The original context is that people that show up in an ER that have attempted to commit suicide, you could give them ketamine and basically provide a window where they could get into therapy and, move away from this, really horrible, depressed, suicidal type state. And that really, strong potential has then, because of this ability to prescribe off label, has then ballooned into what you were just describing, these sort of, clinics almost everywhere where you can, easily get treatment. The best medical use is probably somewhere in between. We're probably seeing an overuse right now, and I imagine that some of that need will be displaced by these other therapies like psilocybin therapy that are coming out. But the rapidness of, sort of just everybody can have access, I don't think will be the exact same because of the off-label prescription technicality.
Yeah, I could see what you mean by that. That, I guess, to your point, ketamine already kind of had a bit of a head start. But I do think it's kind of, maybe it's just the growth that has been so fast that has made people start to think twice about that kind of growth and that kind of the focus on the money aspect of it.
It definitely speaks also too to the public desire to have alternative therapies in this space. And I think whenever you have a really, really large public desire, you have people that will try to meet that desire with a much more profit motivated versus a long-term value and, betterment sort of philosophy. And so I think, in the situation that you're describing, you have all of the above.
And that's certainly been a topic amongst the investing community, is that most of the people that are involved investing in or raising money for psychedelic companies, and mostly told people getting into it is like, this is not a quick exit. This is not like a cannabis stock where you're going to get in and hopefully it's going to jump and then you're going to get back at it. That this is a long game. This is a long-term effort, because these studies take a while. We're at the beginning of the ball game here. So this is a much longer horizon that we're looking at, not a quick fix.
It's very analogous to a biopharma startup pharmaceutical type, company as an analogy. And the difference though is that in those cases, you're almost always starting with a novel drug that you don't really know the safety profile of. You know that you have some data that it's effective for your condition, but there's a lot of open questions, and each of those questions is a failure point. We are operating in a similar developmental context, but our starting template has seen thousands of years of human use across all sorts of different time periods. And so we know that there's a strong profile of safety, and we know that there's a strong profile of efficacy. So it kind of gives us the best case scenario to be working in a biopharma development space, because we aren't starting from scratch. We're starting from one of the most valuable products of nature. It's a very different proposition that way.
And just to touch on the safety, because I don't think we've really gone there. Are there any bad side effects? Are there any safety issues or concerns?
So the biggest safety concerns are making sure that people are monitored during the acute effects, making sure that they don't have the potential to, under the influence, make poor decisions and then harm themselves or others. This is sort of the primary, sort of effect that needs to be dealt with. Interestingly, though, if you look at data about just general population use and hospitalization rates and different recreational drug substances, whether they be misused pharmaceuticals or black market street drugs, psilocybin is actually one of the safest in that entire category, just in a whole population use sense, and is seen use across thousands of years of human history. This is de facto very sort of strong safety profile for the compound. Certainly there's issues of how do people handle themselves while intoxicated, but that can definitely be addressed with proper monitoring, et cetera.
Yeah, it's interesting to know if you want to compare it to a novel drug for some other indication through the regular pharmaceutical industry. The failure rate is, out of 20 drugs that make it to the clinic, one might make it to the market. And the two issues are safety, generally safety, and efficacy. And those are actually not really the serious problems with many of the psychedelic drugs we're looking at now. But as Rob said, they've proven themselves. Now, with that in mind, of course, the reason you want to actually monitor and have a good handle on dosage and what percentage of your product is in there, et cetera, is that there's no substance on earth that if you take too much of it won't cause you harm. It's always about the dose. So finding the appropriate dose is very, very important for any particular indication, and as a safety measure as well. And that's always been the problem, or one of the major problems with home brews and people making street drugs, et cetera. Not only were they dosed inappropriately, or they were just intrinsically toxic, they had impurities in them. They're not well characterized materials, and so that's been a huge problem. And one of the reasons there was I think a lot of legislation around it is that you just have an inherently unsafe experiment going on.
Do you feel that it was unfairly lumped into a category in the sense of, as we know, cannabis is a Schedule I drug and it's compared to heroin, and it certainly isn't. Do you feel that the psychedelics have kind of been unfairly lumped into categories with, LSD or who knows what, PCP or something like that?
Yeah, I think when they were scheduled, it was really a misstep, because at that time there was solid clinical evidence that they were seeing, massive improvements in depression treatment, in addiction treatment. At that time, depression was inclusive of PTSD. There wasn't a separate designation for PTSD, and so just by the definition of the schedules in the U.S., it would seem like that was a misstep, because there was already solid evidence that needs to be medically applied. that would suggest to me that they should be treated more as a lower scheduled substance, something that's, you know, medically prescription available. So I think we basically, in a lot of ways, missed out on 30 or 40 years of potentially really valuable research because of that misstep. It's been incredibly hard to do research on Schedule I compounds until very recently.
And we have a question. Are you confident that you will create a drug that can be prescribed for a relatively wide range of individuals and be safe for personal and maybe even regular usage? Or will the presence of a professional be required in the next few years?
I think in the short term, everything that we're doing is enabling that second scenario of a widely prescribable drug, but that is always used in the context of medical supervision.
Okay. Well, who knows? I mean, to your point, we're just at the beginning of all this, and there's certainly
There's a lot of
way to
open
go.
stages beyond that, definitely. There's a lot of questions that need to be answered before we can move beyond that point.
Before you can just send someone to CVS with their Mydecine prescription. Well, it is really fascinating, and I know that we're starting to get close to our 90-minute shut off. Is there anything that any of you wanted to make sure that you brought up within context of this discussion that you didn't feel that you feel didn't get touched on?
Well, I would love just to say in response to the most recent question, implying there might be an interest in regular usage, and I feel that from when the context is recovery from a mental health problem, when it's the context is therapeutics, then really that question is probably not the right one to ask, because ideally what we're not looking for something that works well for regular usage. Actually, we find a intervention that you only need once, or maybe the twice or three times that we've been discussing. And so I think we're far beyond halfway there already. From the early trials suggests that we can expect some very good outcomes without regular usage, rather with only one or two kinds of experiences like this. So that's the extraordinary part. If the mechanism is, and it seems, partly psychological and of course partly neurophysiological, if we can look at different doses at the psychological level, if we look at this company, or the host is microdosing, that has to have a different psychological mechanism, because essentially such dosing does not provoke the kinds of experiences that the high dosing does. In fact, the psychedelic effect. So this is good research. This research needs to be done, and that would be the model of perhaps regular repeated use. And there might be some benefits from these very low dosing. But when we're talking about the moderate or high dose, we're definitely not really targeting at this point, if our outcomes, what we're looking for are therapeutic recovery from mental health problems like depression and PTSD. We're not hoping for something ideally that requires the regular use, but rather something that's extraordinary, that can provoke some kind of profound kind of an experience that really changes a person more or less once and for all, that now they really are have a new sort of experience of themselves, and would not need the repeated use, but are fully recovered from their mental health problem.
Well, that was a great place to end off. I'm sure, though, that Harvard Business School will not like that answer, because they would say, no, you got to have something that's going to keep them coming back for more. And instead, you're like, look, I want to solve this problem, and I want to help these people so that they don't need to keep coming back for more. And that's kind of a unique element of this particular drug and of these studies is it isn't looking to tie up the patients with a long-term protocol. It's really looking to get in, help them, and be out.
I think that is a great way to wrap up this whole episode. I want to thank everyone for attending and thank my awesome speakers here. This was a great and very eventful, very insightful event. Just to let everybody know that you can stick around and join the lounge and still chat with other people. When we end the event, it doesn't boot you out. So feel free to stay, chat with the Mydecine team, learn a little bit more about them, network with other people. Feel free. The world is your oyster. So thanks again for attending, and thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mydecine, for an excellent series.